Alexander Kupny, a Chernobyl liquidator employed by the nuclear power plant for 21 years, between 1988 and 2009 with his own YouTube channel in Russian, recently made a video in which he read a long article from 1990. The article was published in a local newspaper in the Chernobyl region, and apparently did not receive widespread attention. The authors are described as Chernobyl liquidation veterans, people who worked at the nuclear power plant. Among them, the familiar Nikolai Karpan, who was Deputy Chief Engineer for Science and Nuclear Safety at the time of the disaster. For the few videos to come, we will be referring to the digital reprinting of the article on the website uatom.org, which enables a full translation at the click of a button. We will try not to read the article word for word, reading some quotes while relying on displayed passages to ground a discussion of it. We will leave it to viewers to spend more time with the article if they choose, and try to keep things moving. The authors begin by informing us that an accurate understanding of the disaster was beset by similar challenges 4 years after the destruction of Chernobyl Unit 4 as it is today nearly 40 years later. Films, stories, essays, reports, books, all sort of media content, nowadays including social media, of which YouTube is essentially a part, are made that swell the quantity of Chernobyl material out in public, while much less so the quality of it. The authors point out some sources make real attempts to get at the truth of the disaster and who actually caused it, but in their time these sources were either classified or their publication was limited. Nowadays, while important information remains classified, much is openly accessible. But the initial narrative has taken root, and it remains a popular opinion that a series of grave violations of rules and regulations by Chernobyl operators is at the heart of the disaster. Obviously, the RBMK blew up while there were operators in the control room. In an age preceding the benevolent management of everything by our impending AI overlords, that's just a tautology. Does that explain the disaster? People remote from nuclear energy are understandably susceptible to associating the event with the operators. When a disaster occurs seemingly out of nowhere, would people coming from a position of ignorance not be reasonably receptive to claims of operator negligence, arrogance, misunderstanding of the technological process, loss of a sense of danger, etc.? When such a narrative comes from top-level experts who, in their right mind, would assume these characterizations would be more applicable to the experts themselves, people of likely superlative intelligence and knowledge, than to the lowly operators much more plausibly summarized as schmucks pressing buttons. The authors identify two primary expert entities that should be familiar to regular viewers of the channel. The chief designer of the RBMK type reactor represented by the Research and Design Institute of Power Engineering, NICIAT, headed by academician N.A. Dolezal, and the scientific supervisor, represented by the I.V. Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, headed by the former president of the USSR Academy of Sciences, A.P. Alexandrov. We have recently learned that not only was the director of the Kurchatov Institute, Anatoly Alexandrov, the president of the USSR Academy of Sciences at the time of the disaster, but his deputy directors of the Kurchatov Institute, Valery Legasov and Evgeny Velikhov, were also vice presidents of the USSR Academy of Sciences. They don't get any more expert than that. The authors attack newly minted would-be writers who do not understand and do not want to understand anything, continuously pouring mud on the operators. Then they urge people who express an opinion on the Chernobyl disaster without understanding it to be patient and read the article carefully and completely. The authors point out that the truth of the disaster is grounded in the very narrow circle of specialists who controlled the narrative. These nuclear energy specialists at the aforementioned NICIAT and Kurchatov Institutes wrote the regulatory documents that should naturally serve as the basis for holding people accountable. The authors highlight two fundamental documents: Nuclear Safety Rules for Nuclear Power Plants, ABY 0474, and General Provisions for Ensuring the Safety of Nuclear Power Plants in Design, Construction and Operation, OPB 82, that were supposed to be strictly observed by the designers, developers and operators. What you will notice about the content of these documents is that they, in a way, superseded operating instructions and were above the heads of operators. The authors of the article proceed by introducing the positive scram effect control and protection system rods topic that everyone more or less understands at a basic level. The AZ5 shutdown power-up button that inserted all rods into the core only to free the reactor core innards from their cramped prison under the 2,000-ton steel, concrete and serpentine filler cover called Yelena. The authors highlight the omission of this peculiar positive scram effect in the post-disaster Soviet expert report to the International Vienna meeting versus the realization of its importance internally. This was clearly intentional. In either thesis of what caused the disaster, the public or the classified one, the operators are ascribed most of the blame. The difference is the mention of a design shortcoming being integral to the disaster. But what trying to hide this information reveals is that Soviet experts were willing to lie. The biggest popular misconception of Chernobyl is about how far the lies went, as well as who masterminded them. Granted, the positive scram effect was colossally important. Indeed, as American experts apparently concluded, the reactor shutdown system itself is the cause of the surge in reactivity power. For all their croaking about the rundown tests being conducted before the destruction of Reactor 4, Soviet experts publicly forgot to mention what actually exploded the reactor. But there were apparently in the region of 32 violations of the principal regulations attributable to the Soviet experts. Chief among them is there being such a condition or set of conditions where the emergency protection system wouldn't work. Even emergency conditions according to the design rules were supposed to be overcome by the emergency protection system. Furthermore, there were supposed to be two independent emergency protection systems in case of failure of one, the humorous fulfillment attempt at which we will encounter shortly. So, we arrive at what Kurchatov Institute scientists had the cheek to call the paradox of Chernobyl. At the beginning of the safety test preceding the explosions, the reactor parameters were closest to stable. According to the authors of the article, nothing all that much happened during the test. Annex 1 of the Hallmark INSAG 7 report conveys as much, claiming that according to both Soviet and American calculations, the release of positive reactivity due to a degree of conversion from water to steam in the reactor core was actually negligible and easy to compensate for. There is an interesting indication this was true in the first second following the activation of AZ5, the shutdown. The reactor power actually immediately decreased, never having reached 300 megawatts. Yet in the following 2 seconds, it spiked beyond 530 megawatts, and in the handful of seconds afterwards, it reached tens of thousands of megawatts, resulting in the first explosion of the reactor core that sent Big Yelena through the roof of the building. The article authors point out that this is so the comrades from the IAE, Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, do not hide from themselves in their report. In the state in which the reactor was, pressing the AZ5 button can lead to an increase in reactivity, and the acceleration of the reactor within the first few seconds. The state in which the reactor was is the other key topic, obfuscated by lies. But the authors of the article were in no mood to move on yet. Long story short, they reiterate that according to the regulatory documents, there isn't supposed to be such a thing as a state where the shutdown button becomes a power-up button, which isn't even communicated to the operators. And so we come to the amusing development of what Soviet experts apparently considered to be two independent emergency protection systems in case one failed. In the RBMK reactor, there were merely two subsets of the total number of reactor control and protection system rods that descended into the core simultaneously with the same descent floor. To add injury to insult, the Deputy Minister of Energy, in a draft letter to Soviet leader Gorbachev, reveals that the increased number of rods from first generation to second generation RBMK reactors actually contributed to the positive scram effect, aggravating the design flaw. An example of an actual second independent emergency protection system in other nuclear reactors is an injectable liquid neutron poison. Then the authors shift into abominably long paragraph mode. They make the point that it was the experts' job, high-level scientists, engineers, and designers, to quantitatively understand the reactor and comply with their own safety standards. Instead, there was a deference to the prestige and authority of Soviet experts who gave assurances in words. For example, the chief designer stated, "The core of the RBMK reactor and fuel assemblies, as well as the control and protection system and its executive bodies, are made taking into account the basic requirements of the reactor nuclear safety provisions, which is ensured in all operating modes and states of the reactor, as well as in any possible emergency situations in the technological circuit." As Chernobyl scapegoat Anatoly Dyatlov pointed out, one thing existed in words and another in practice. The article authors mentioned that Soviet experts convinced everyone of the complete safety of their brainchild, including the Soviet government. Anatoly Alexandrov, the director of the Kurchatov Institute, stated that an RBMK reactor could be placed in the middle of Moscow. His counterpart at Nikiet, Nikolai Dolozhov, is brought up in Politburo notes after the disaster, having expressed misgivings about the RBMK reactor being located close to cities. His concern was dismissed in an unclear context, but at no point in our reading is anyone pointing the finger at the Soviet government as being responsible for nuclear safety over the expert establishment. Indeed, the Soviet government rued the independence given to one ministry in particular, the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, or Sredmash, responsible for the nuclear development of the country, which was an umbrella for nuclear experts and is supposed to have attracted the Soviet Union's best and brightest. We will discuss further the ahistorical framing of Chernobyl as dutiful scientists against an oppressive government that the HBO miniseries has popularised a little later. Meanwhile, the article authors highlight a statement in the information submitted to the International Atomic Energy Agency that the slow movement of the control and protection system rods was supposed to be compensated for by their number. Except, as was written in the draft letter from the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Energy, addressed to Soviet leader Gorbachev, increasing the number of control rods actually contributed to the positive scram effect, due to the addition of more displaceable water columns at the bottom of the reactor. Long story short, as will become increasingly apparent, when it came to Chernobyl, Soviet experts didn't really know what they were doing. The rest of the paragraph covers the inadequacy of full rod insertion taking 18 to 20 seconds versus the up to 5 second standard elsewhere in the world. Abominably long paragraph number 2 begins with perhaps the disaster's most outstanding question. Why had an RBMK reactor not exploded earlier? In our The Chernobyls That Weren't miniseries, we bring up two instances pre-Chernobyl that bore striking similarities to the historic disaster, yet didn't escalate to calamity. If we are to have one contribution to clarifying the causes of Chernobyl, it's in bringing up and reiterating that a few years before the disaster, a design modification to the control rods was implemented that reduced the length of the graphite displacers, thereby increasing the length of the water columns at the bottom of the reactor, thus augmenting or even creating the positive scram effect as it is commonly known when, on rod descent, the graphite displacers already in the middle of the core would push out the neutron-absorbing water columns at the bottom of the core. We're inclined to believe Chernobyl Unit 4 was one of the debutants for this change, and the disaster occurred about as early as could be expected. To many contemporaries, however, this design change was either unknown or overlooked. So the article authors in the early 1990s proceed to drone on, which we have to observe. Consider yourselves fortunate that you're watching rather than making this video. Quote, "To answer it, it is necessary to consider the participation, role, of the first working group of CPS rods in emergency modes. Its contribution to the reactor emergency protection system." Honestly, even we don't know what the hell this means. In the subsequent sentence, the article authors proceed to state that the required certain knowledge of the physics of the RBMK was still not completely known by scientists of the day, let alone by operators. Nonetheless, the authors proclaim that they will limit themselves to facts. Well, the weak experimental base and a chronic lag in computer technology, they mention, is one of the underlying facts of Chernobyl. VP Volkov, head of the IV Kurchatov Institute research group on the reliability and safety of nuclear power plants with RBMK reactors, who referred Kurchatov Institute director Anatoly Alexandrov to the prosecutor's office after the disaster, and was subsequently barred from going to work at the institute, explained the inadequate level of scientific management, above all, by the following. The extremely low number of studies of the neutron physics processes taking place in the RBMK core, a disregard for the discrepancies in the results obtained using different methods, the lack of experimental studies under conditions close to the natural ones, the lack of analysis of specialised publications, and, in the long run, the transmission to the chief design engineer of incorrect techniques for calculating the neutron physics processes used to analyse the processes taking place in the core and the safety of plants with RBMK reactors. Politburo notes reveal Soviet leaders questioning Deputy Director of the Kurchatov Institute, Valery Legasov, and bringing up Alexandrov in the same vein. Most impressive, however, are the recollections of Alexander N. Rumyantsev. Rumyantsev worked under Savily M. Feinberg, one of the real fathers of the RBMK despite Alexandrov taking out patents. Rumyantsev specialised in the nascent field of computer analysis. On the eve of the startup of the very first RBMK in 1973, Feinberg confided in Rumyantsev, "Sasha, we have created something that the human mind can no longer comprehend. We will start the reactor by November 7th. There are 30 to 40 channels in total. And then we will return to your calculations. Until we get to the full load of the core, we will have time to check and clarify everything again." Here, the real inventor of the RBMK reactor admits that the creation transcended human calculation, and shows reliance on his computer specialist for continuing analysis that was proving problematic. Then Feinberg mysteriously fell ill at a seminar he flew to, and promptly died. Rumyantsev was sidelined and left the Kurchatov Institute to work at the International Atomic Energy Agency for several years. After his return, he witnessed the following scene at a November 13th, 1984 formal meeting of the Kurchatov Institute Party and economic activists. One of the speakers was L.V. Mayarov, chairman of the Council of Computer Users. Mayarov warned that the lack of computing power does not allow for the necessary analysis of the safety of the design decisions made at nuclear power plants, and that the most likely candidate for a serious accident is the latest RBMK units with all the improvements implemented in them. This drew priceless reactions from Deputy Director Legasov and Director Alexandrov. VA Legasov reacted violently to what he heard, switching to personal insults against L.V. Mayarov. AP Alexandrov was mostly silent, but he took this information so close to heart that 3 days later he raised the question of abolishing the OVTIR, which was done. Legasov shouted down the warning, whereas Alexandrov abolished a computer department at the institute. At the bottom of the paragraph, we find the pineapple on the cake. Tapes with recordings of speeches and discussions at this enlarged meeting of the party and economic activists disappeared from the archives of the party committee in May to June 1986 after the accident at the 4th unit of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Returning to the article, the authors claim that there was no limit on how many or how far control rods could be extracted from the reactor from 1973 to 1980, as was standard in other nuclear reactors. We encountered this claim from another present-day source, looking back on regulations in the Smolensk 1985 video. Consequently, it was not uncommon to have operating reactivity margins of 1 to 3 remaining control rods after short-term shutdowns. The so-called starts from scratch without passing the iodine pit. Chernobyl was not unique. The concern in these circumstances was controlling the power density distribution as it's referred to in INSAC 7, or preventing local hotspots that could result in damage. Soviet scientists acknowledged that the RBMK was put into operation without a prototype reactor and without calculating its processes. They literally learned from experience, and the RBMK had justifiably been criticised as a commercial experiment. They learned, with the 1975 Leningrad incident no doubt being a lesson, that RBMK reactors had an instability of power distribution as additional absorbers were being removed from them to enable greater fuel burnup. At the bottom of the paragraph, we seem to have arrived at an answer to a mystery. Therefore, in the technological regulations of the Chernobyl MPP of 1980, for the first time, a restriction on the CPS appeared. Work with the ORR of less than 10 CPS rods is not allowed. In INSAC 7, there is a strange mention of a lower ORM limit of 10 rather than 15 rods. It appears this indeed was the case, at least for a time, although the document cited in INSAC 7 is dated as late as 1983. We'll leave it to the article authors to guide our discussion further. According to the authors, 1983 is when the lower ORM limit of 15 rods, or having to keep the equivalent of 15 rods inserted into the core, makes an appearance, rather unceremoniously. Not much attention was drawn to this, as the authors assert even Soviet nuclear experts did not understand that among the most recent updates of the ever-modified RBMK project lurked a disastrous danger that transformed the significance of rod extraction from the appearance of hotspots during power rises to the insertion of positive reactivity during the act of shutting down a reactor. The lower ORM limit was never meant to signify whether the emergency protection system worked. Many RBMK operators and those who worked at RBMK nuclear power plants claimed that the positive scram effect always existed. The article authors themselves bring up how operators would encounter unnatural power behaviour, strangely during the movement of individual rods. It's a testament to Soviet secrecy that even nuclear power plant workers somehow remained ignorant of the crux of Chernobyl. Look at the rod dimensions mentioned in the paragraph. Graphite displacers 4.5 meters long, absorbers 5 meters long. These are incorrect dimensions. Chernobyl Unit 4 is known to have 4.5 meter displacers with 6.2 meter absorbers. These were modified rods. The preceding design was with displacers of 5 meters and with absorbers of 5 meters. Neither INSAC 7, nor the operators, nor nuclear power plant workers bemoaning the ignorance of everyone catch the fact that the control rods were changed. We have already documented this in other videos. It is the design change to the dimensions of the control rods that increased the height of the water columns at the bottom of the reactor, intensifying any pre-existing unnatural power behaviour associated with rod movement. We think this is why the positive scram effect was officially discovered in the 1980s rather than from as early as 1973, and during any of the several RBMK reactor startups that followed. The late experimental discovery of the effect at new reactor startups is a fact unobserved and unquestioned by anyone. The needle isn't in the haystack, it's in your eye. The article authors point out that even in 1984, as Nikiot was responding to the discovery of the effect, there was a "this is not a bug but a feature" mantra. Then they highlight a key sentence from a letter sent by the deputy director of Nikiot to, among other nuclear power plants, Chernobyl, in February of 1984. Letters emphasize once again that the positive reactivity rundown will be observed when the rods move only from the highest position and only when the neutron field is skewed downwards. The article authors immediately point out that the neutron field was skewed upwards at the time of the Chernobyl disaster. Yet the letter goes on to say, "Thus we are dealing with a well-known phenomenon. Decisions have already been made on it. Herein lies part of the Chernobyl cover-up that persists to today." On page 15 of INSAG 7, claims that restrictions on the complete withdrawal of control and safety rods from the core were intended, but mysteriously never implemented, and that apparently the matter was just forgotten. The HBO miniseries idiotically suggests that the Soviet government intervened, as if there wasn't constant change in the development of the quasi-experimental RBMK project, and as if Soviet experts controlling said development were doing so in public. The reality is, Soviet experts misunderstood the significance of what they discovered, and their reaction was insufficient. Deputy Chief Engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant at the time of the disaster, Anatoly Dyatlov, writes that the restriction of control rod extraction, separate from the limit on the operating reactivity margin, was included in the operating procedures. However, as the article authors also highlight, the restriction was based on the neutron flux being skewed downward, not upward as it was at Chernobyl. The restriction, as written by Soviet experts, did not apply. The first listed measure in the article was also adopted. The graphite displacers under the relatively few automatic regulator rods were removed. This was also inadequate. The third and fourth items were among those not actually adopted. They entailed significant redesigns of the control rods that Soviet experts deemed not immediately necessary. Pressure from the Soviet government existed to not disrupt the nuclear energy generation of the country. The little-known historical importance of which we have encountered yet again this time in a New York Times article published a few weeks after the disaster, pointing out that in those decades of the 20th century, the Soviet Union was running into issues with other sources of energy. But it was up to Soviet experts to deal with design, engineering, and scientific issues. The role of the Soviet government, while present, was more indirect than the ridiculous portrayal of tyrannical imbeciles taking over nuclear safety policy from experts in the field. There is a good chance that the Soviet government didn't know much of anything before the disaster. The Soviet central government, at least in contrast to a couple of the more specialised ministries, where things get a little murkier. In early June of 1986, Soviet leader Gorbachev was concerned about being manipulated by Soviet experts, and their all kinds of professional conclusions, which are actually just excuses. The article authors point out further failings of Soviet experts. There were rods, abbreviated as USP, that entered the core from below. These rods were not promptly connected to the shutdown system after the discovery of the positive scram effect, and no instructions were made regarding their minimal insertion. They could have prevented the disaster. Furthermore, as is also pointed out in INSAG 7, the new restrictions on control rod removal were by no means consistent with the maintenance of a minimal operating reactivity margin. What Soviet experts resorted to after the disaster of their own making was play games. We made an entire video, which we ever so humbly recommend, on the matter of the validity of the figure of 6 to 8 rods remaining in the core that is popularly associated with the Chernobyl disaster. If you're in the mood for a game of deceit, take the time to peruse the details of that matter. The article authors proceed to mention the lackadaisical treatment of the operating reactivity margin, or number of effective control rods in the core, lower limit in the design of the facility. There were very much violations of the regulations here. There was no alarm associated with the ORM lower limit, nor was there a device in the control room that continually monitored it. Instead, there was a person from a separate computer room 40 to 50 meters away who visited every couple of hours with a printout. At 1 AM, less than half an hour before the disaster, this person was due to visit. This person reported he visited, and operators reported that what they saw was an ORM above the lower limit. There is no mention of this in the major public reports. Then there is another controversy over whether the lower ORM limit prevented insertion of positive reactivity on shutdown. The article authors claim it was a happy accident that Chernobyl hadn't already occurred, but they missed a piece of the puzzle. Lastly, the authors point out how, from the beginning, there were different, safer design alternatives for the control rods, but entailing greater expense. This sort of thing is probably common as the air we breathe and the food we eat. Compromises are made. Often the trick is in the balance. For all that was done wrong in the design of the RBMK reactors, at a fundamental level, avoiding Chernobyl was remarkably close. For instance, the association of USP rods inserting from the bottom of the reactor with the shutdown system was apparently planned in the maintenance period after the shutdown that blew up Unit 4. Bigger changes were made after the disaster, but too late.